Let's go live. So we're going to be live in. We're ready to go. Wonderful. And we'll change it to speaker view. So good evening and welcome everyone to joining me today for this latest installment in the Play UK Russia programme, an innovative programme to create connections between the UK and Russian games industry professionals. The programme is delivered by the Cultural and Education section of the British Embassy in Moscow, the Universal University and Scream School in Moscow, and UKI, the Trade Association for Games. Just a couple of housekeeping things as we start the session here. Firstly, at the bottom of your screen, you will find a Q&A button. And if you have questions today for our guest, please put your questions in the Q&A, and I will get those questions asked of Tim as and when we can work them into the program, and ask as many questions as you like. We also have an interpreter with us today who will be interpreting everything into Russian. There is an interpretation button at the bottom corner. Click on that and choose your language channel. Sasha, did you want to talk about that? Wonderful. So thank you very much, as I said, for joining us here today. Now, the United Kingdom is a powerhouse in games development and publishing, from those early days of bedroom coders through to multinational studios of today. The UK has been at the forefront of games development and games commerce for over 40 years. But at the heart of the games industry, whether you're in the UK or in Russia and around the world, at the heart of the games industry are the incredible people that lead and inspire the sector. And this series of events will bring 5 industry leaders from the UK games industry who will share their stories, their passions, their successes, probably some of their failures as well as we go, because we can always learn from failures. In many cases, they're legends of the industry, but more importantly, that each and every one of them are still at the top of their game, creating, publishing, commercializing, enthralling experiences for the players of today. Last week, we met Peter Molyneux, and the recording of that will be available soon so that you can catch up on that if you missed it. And I'm delighted tonight to be interviewing Tim Woodley. Now, Tim's has over 20 years experience in the games industry. He's held prominent positions in large NASDAQ listed corporations through to small independent developers. And he currently heads up all commercial and publishing efforts at Hello Games. As you can see behind his picture, an enormous Hello logo. They're a UK-based independent developer and the creators of the amazing No Man's Sky, which I like to say is an industry-defining indie game. But we'll come on to later whether it is an indie game or not, Tim. That might be something to talk about. Tim is also the chair of the UK games trade body UKI and is the ambassador for video games charity Special Effect. So Tim, that was quite an introduction. Welcome. Now let's start. And why don't we start at the start? So how did you get into games? What was your career path into the games industry?
Yeah, thank you, Sam, and thank you for the opportunity to talk today. It's always good to sort of reminisce, I suppose, about 20 years. I was talking to someone the other day, and I must remember to talk slowly for the interpreter's sake. I was talking to someone the other day who had 35 years experience and bemoaning the fact that my 20 years was quite meaningless. And they were like, well, yes, but the last 30 don't really mean anything, because things move so fast that you only really need to know about the last 5 to have any idea of what's going on. But yeah, looking back to when I first joined, I came out of university, and my first love was music, and I joined the music industry, and I stayed in the music industry for about 5 years. And then I found that it was actually killing my love for music. There's only so many gigs that you can attend, and with a sort of commercial and critical eye, and you're sat at the back with the rest of the industry knobs going, well, it's great, but will it sell anything? That was where I found myself after 5 years in the music industry. And by lucky hap, I worked for an agency in the music industry that specialized in hip hop and R&B and all of the black music that was coming through into the UK at that time. So we're talking late 90s. It was the Fugees, Missy Elliott, Busta Rhymes, all of these US artists that were coming over to the UK and starting to break through. I tell this story only because one of our clients was Activision, weirdly enough, because Activision at the time had a game around the Wu-Tang Clan that they decided that they thought that putting the Wu-Tang into a fighting game on PlayStation 1, we're talking now, would be a really good idea. So we promoted that game for them in the hip hop community in the UK. And then they poached me fair and square from that moment onwards. And on joining Activision, I have to say, I then learned how many units they were forecasting to sell of this Wu-Tang game. And it was far more than the Wu-Tang had ever sold in albums in the UK. So they were vastly over forecasting what that game could actually do. But that was probably Activision to a T anyway.
That Wu-Tang Clan game. I remember wasn't it a 4-player beat 'em up? It was quite a bizarre, sort of almost isometric game, and that's quite an amazing technical achievement actually to get 4-player fighting game.
Yeah, it was I mean, it was based on a well-known Gorefest engine, and you know, it was playing very much to the kind of, you know, gruesome graphics, you know, very Tekken-esque. It was proper beat 'em up, but they went you know, hell for leather on and really lent into that. But it was Activision of, you know, that you wouldn't recognize today. So we're talking now early 2000s. I joined the company, and the first game that I worked on, or the first games that I worked on, was number one was Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1, or Tony Hawk Skateboarding, as it was called in the UK, because there was a fear that people wouldn't understand what pro skating was, and they would think that it was like an ice skating game or something in Europe. So skateboarding was the official name, and it was only by Pro Skater 2 that actually people thought that, well, that's clearly nonsense. So let's just call it what we call it everywhere else in the world. And the other game that I worked on first and foremost was Spider-Man for PlayStation 1, which had nothing to do with, you know, the MCU as we know it. It was very much, you know, prior to the first Spider-Man movie of the modern era launching. But I got to look after that one because it was being made by the same developer as Tony Hawk, Neversoft. And so, yeah, those were the two sort of inaugural products that I worked on. And I do remember.
What a lucky start! Imagine enormous games like that.
Very,
you know,
very
you haven't worked your way up; you've just fallen straight on your feet, haven't you?
It's very true. It's very true. It was a very auspicious beginning. But I remember in one of the first stand-ups that we had at Activision in Europe, the MD said something to the ilk of, you know, oh, we're forecasting to generate something in the region of just below $1 billion this year. And I remember boldly putting my hand up in that environment and wanting to ask a question. Say, oh, when do you think we'll ever get to that $1 billion a year mark? And of course, that now seems incredibly trite. And now they don't get out of bed for less than $1 billion franchise. So yeah, I stayed with Activision for about 6 years, and yeah, it was a really great training ground for.
Well, I was going to ask,
my career.
what was the games industry like in those days? I mean, we're a lot of our audience today will be majority of them will be fairly new to the games industry, just finding their way, maybe still studying and thinking about getting into this. You can still learn a lot from the ways of the past, can't you? What was the games industry like when you first got into it?
It was very rock and roll. I mean, Activision had been around for about 20 years as a name, at least. And while I was there, I think we celebrated the 25th anniversary of Activision, the brand almost. But the Activision that I was there from 2000 to 2006 was, it started off as a very sort of kind of, we were just having a lot of fun, rolling our sleeves up, doing a lot of events and kind of marketing. My role was mainly in the marketing department, and everything was done very in a touchy-feely kind of way. And it was only later in my tenure there that everything became quite a bit more serious, as NASDAQ companies quite often do, and as development costs get bigger and bigger, then the marketing has to be, rationalized and researched, and the marketing budgets were increasing as much as the development costs were, because the idea is that you're protecting that development cost as it gets more nosebleedy, as I call it. And yeah, when you're spending that kind of money, you want to make sure you're spending it in the right areas and not being kind of frivolous with it. So we would have there was a phrase that we used: focus on the things that matter. And the things that matter in a marketing capacity at Activision in those days, and I'm sure it's changed now and probably flipped back around to, actually innovating and having some fun with it. The things that matter were: get your front of box right, get your TV ad right, get your trade marketing right. I can't remember what the other two were, but though it was really down to the nuts and bolts. And the same was true of the forecasting methodologies that we were learning. A lot of it from FMCG world. It was a sign that this hobbyist industry and this kind of company that had grown up quite organically was really starting to mature and take itself seriously, particularly as those pressures, the stock market pressures, continued to grow. And anyone who knows anything about the NASDAQ floated companies, it's as much about where your growth is coming from as it is anything else. Year on year growth, quarter on quarter growth even, and that pressure of delivering an earnings call is really, really paramount. So the mantra there again seems quite trite now, but the mantra was add another 1 million unit seller every year. That was the way we were going to grow. And we were also number 2 at that time. Like we were a strong number 2 and quite a fast number 2 as well. I think Tony Hawk, Spider-Man and others, really got us to the number 2 slot, almost as I was arriving. And then we were just trying to chase EA for 5 years. And everything we were doing was, how do we overtake EA? Because they were firmly ensconced in that number 1 position for a long time. So we would add Call of Duty because they had Medal of Honor and we needed something in the shooter space. We would go out and buy a racing studio because they had Need for Speed and we had nothing to combat that in market share. So it was those sorts of kind of market share battles that seem weirdly redundant in this day and age, but that was the way that we were going to overtake them. And then shortly after I left, they Vivendi merged and Activision Blizzard became for a while became the biggest, well, certainly the biggest corporation that we knew in the video games world.
I'm going to ask you a little bit about forecasting later on. I think we'll get to that. It's such an art. It's such a difficult thing to do. And here we are talking about, multi-million-dollar budgets and big teams. I think, maybe some of our audience are thinking more at the other end of the spectrum, but still equally difficult and equally challenging to get those numbers correct. Now, so when you joined the industry, you left from music, you joined games, but did you have a vision in mind? Was there a particular sort of career path for Tim Woodley? Was there something laid out in your mind?
No, there wasn't. And I'm probably a bit embarrassed to say that gaming was never my first love. Unlike Peter Molyneux, and I feel almost embarrassed to sort of follow him on the slate here, because he is such a legend and has been around and has been developing games, from when he was a small nipper. I wouldn't know how to develop a game, and I'm sorry to disappoint your audience, even though I've been in the industry for 20 years. What goes into making a game is something I know only very cursorily, having been involved in development. But my role has always been on the commercial side and on the publishing side. But I've grown to really love this industry, and love what gaming is and what gaming can do. So I can't hand on heart say that I got into games because I've always loved games. In fact, possibly the opposite. I left music because it was killing my love for music, and I was looking for something that interested me and that I found intriguing. And I suppose I've always been into technology and where technology is taking us, and that was good enough for me. But I call it falling up the ladder. I've never really had huge amounts of ambition. I just do good work, hopefully, and that good work hopefully gets recognized by the people that employ me, and then that then leads to a career as such. And so far so good. It's stood me in good stead. But I'm no way sort of planning out my, I've never been one to plan out my next 20, 30, 40 years. It's just not in my DNA.
There doesn't have to be a master plan. I just wondered whether there was. And like you said earlier, who knows, because the industry changes so quickly. Who knows where you're going to be in the next couple of years? Things change so quickly. Just going to hark back to some of that Activision times. These are exciting times in the industry, big, enormous intellectual property, some big names that you've mentioned, and that absolute drive from the business to gain market share. Now, that puts a lot of pressure on someone like yourself, who's having to look after those individual products and formulate marketing campaigns and the like. How do you do that? I mean, let's think about it from a big game, and then maybe later on we'll look at some smaller titles that you've worked on. But Tony Hawk lands on your desk, or Spider-Man sitting there. How on earth do you formulate a promotional campaign, a marketing campaign for something like that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there are two ways of approaching it, and I think a blend of the two that I'm about to describe is probably where the sweet spot is. On the one hand, you need a great game and a great campaign around it that screams innovation and a little bit of fun. You've got to be having fun. Your audience needs to see that you're having fun with the game and with the marketing around it, and for them to feel engaged, not just in the game itself, but in the campaign. The other side of the coin, which was as valuable and probably became a bit too valuable to Activision in those later days, was let's benchmark against the competition, and let's see what they did. What did they spend? Where did they spend it? And let's just do that, or do that, but do it better. And so I can't remember if Tony Hawk had a direct competitor. There was certainly a huge rally of skate games that came along after Tony Hawk launched. And I remember, just as a quick aside, I remember reading a review of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 that said something like, my editor has told me in no uncertain terms, if I mention a certain other skate game in this review more than 5 times, he'll feed me to the dogs or something. And then the last paragraph was like, oh damn, that's 6. So Tony Hawk really sort of was kind of apart from anything else, because it was such a great game and it was in a niche almost of its own. But for something like Call of Duty, as I said, when we first started out, the fact that we had Call of Duty, that we went out and bought the studio that made Medal of Honor, the fact that the marketing campaign around Call of Duty was, I wouldn't say it's a carbon copy of what Medal of Honor had done in previous years to be successful, but it was very much like benchmark against the competition and then do it better, or do it with bigger budgets. That was and I suppose those were the two kind of competing forces at Activision in those times. And I think in any organization at the moment, especially as those budgets get bigger and bigger and the risks get bigger and bigger, you want the surety of, well, this worked for game X 2 years ago, let's do some of that. But that can quite quickly become cookie cutter, and you don't necessarily engage your audience if they feel that all you're really doing is spending a lot of money on TV advertising, or what used to be the as I say, one of the things that mattered was TV advertising, and I'm not sure that's the case anymore. But yeah, those sorts of sureties of how to successfully market a game and how to ship a 1 million plus unit seller again, which is quite a small number these days when you look at what a hit is these days. So.
Exactly. Just picking up on that and following on from the sort of the marketing side, which I think is fascinating. It's a different talk today. We had Peter last week talking about the sort of the creative process, but I'm really interested in how creativity works in general, and in a major publisher. With so many people, one working in the business and two part of that games development team that you're getting this product from, there's a lot of competing voices, there's a lot of egos, there's a lot of people sharing their views. So how on earth do you have a creative process in a big publisher like that? I mean, what are sort of the working habits that you adopt working for a big company like that to get your message through and to show that creativity to get things out?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm thinking back to the Activision days, and again, like the creative process was there, and a lot of it was driven out of America, but a lot of it was objective. And by that I mean, yes, of course, someone has to come up with the idea for the TV ad, for example. Let's use that as the example. An agency will come with 3 or 4 different pitches, storyboards of what that TV ad could be, and that's quite a creative endeavor, between brand manager and agency, knocking ideas backwards and forwards, and we think this will work, or we think this is in tone with the brand. And that's definitely the most creative end of the spectrum. But then as soon as you've kind of got that sort of suite of options available to you, certainly in the Activision era in the early noughties, those 4 or 5 concepts would go into consumer testing, and the consumer would tell us which of these do you prefer, and then that storyboard would turn into a comp, and then it would be tested again, and it would be tested again, and then the final spot would be tested. And again, like Activision was going through this maturing process of, we need to get it right because the budgets are huge and the risks of getting it wrong are huge too. So yeah, maybe one of the reasons why I left Activision and looking at where my career has gone since was it got too strict for me in that regard. It got too kind of objective, and I'm a bit more of a let's come up with these ideas, let's run a little bit more with our guts than anything else. And that's certainly true at the more indie end of the spectrum, where you don't have the kind of budgets to research things to the nth degree. You do have to take a little bit more on trust and on gut. And I think that's it's probably quite telling where my career has gone since then.
Equally important, of course, making these decisions in a small business where they might only have 1 or 2 products is exceptionally risky in its own way. And so it makes sense to go through that due diligence, I guess. I wanted to just remind people actually here today that if you have any questions for Tim, please just put them in the Q&A section at the bottom. I will go and have a look in there periodically. I know we're going to talk about your career here, Tim, and the fascinating story and the twists and turns. I also want to throw a few sort of personal stuff at you, if that's all right.
Sure.
So, I mean, at the moment, you're working for Hello Games based in Guildford. Last week, just by coincidence, Peter Molyneux also based in Guildford.
Yeah.
What makes, I mean, for people that don't know, Guildford is how would you describe Guildford?
Well, people have called it the Hollywood of games, as I think you know, Sam, and I'm not sure it's that, because anyone who comes to Guildford, it's a very it's a very typical English town. It's set in the, for those who don't know, it's in the southeast of England, to the southwest of London. In terms of why Guildford has become such a hotspot of development talent, and it is, you can't go down the high street, as I think Peter mentioned, without bumping into someone from the development community. I think, you know, Peter would probably not say this, but the fact that Peter lived in the area and set up his first studio there in the form of Bullfrog is probably a large part of where the germ of the Guildford community came from. But then quickly thereafter, EA set up their UK/European headquarters in Guildford. And I think that's largely to do with the fact of its proximity to, yes, London, but also Heathrow. We call it the Heathrow corridor, and Heathrow is the largest airport in the UK. So getting in and out of Heathrow to their LA headquarters, global headquarters, or their European subsidiaries was quite important. And now Ubisoft are in Guildford as well, for likely the same reasons, or at least, you know, historically the same reasons. You know, Activision are in the same area, not Guildford, but sort of a little bit north. So there's definitely we call it at Yuki, we call it the hub, right? There's various gaming hubs in the UK, and I suppose development breeds development, and now we've got, I hesitate to sum them all up, but it's at least 20 development studios of some size or other in the Guildford area, because when you're looking to set up a developer, you want ready access to talent, and you know, you could do worse than opening it across the road from Hello Games or EA or Supermassive or any of the other studios that are in the Guildford area. And the same is true of all the other hubs in the UK.
And just taking that a little bit broader, if that's okay. You know, I started by bigging up the UK and saying how great the UK is. I don't know if the audience wants to hear that, but we're here to try and build these connections between UK and Russia. And Russia does have some amazing games companies. There's no doubt about it. Yeah. They perhaps don't have the public profile and the exposure that some of those companies do have in the UK. So a double question for you, if that's okay, really just to keep you on your toes. Why is the UK such a good place to make games, and how can a games industry that's emerging and growing and has enormous potential, like the Russian games industry, sort of replicate that but do it in its own way?
Yeah, it's another good question. I think one of the reasons why the UK is such a powerhouse today is because we got a head start. We've been doing it for a long time. I think if you really trace the origins back, you could probably trace them back to the 1970s, but at least by the 1980s, there were plentiful bedroom coders, and some of the veterans that you're interviewing and that are still in the industry today, you know, grew up in the, you know, their formative years were the 1980s, the ZX Spectrum, the ZX81 from our homegrown Clive Sinclair, God rest his soul, he died a couple of months ago. You know, that was a real catalyst for a school of developers who could make their start in what would become the fledgling video games industry in the UK. I think in terms of, you know, I think that one of the other reasons why we're so successful is because we're such a tight-knit community. We're obviously quite small geographically, certainly relative to Russia. And so there's a huge amount of opportunity for people to kind of cross-pollinate, collaborate, support each other. There's that very real sense of camaraderie and supporting each other in early endeavors. There was a conference in Brighton in the south of England a couple of weeks ago, and I remember remarking to someone, just stood there chatting about how if someone starts up a company in the UK, the first thing that anyone does is rush to their support and say, how can we help you? How can we help you, you know, establish yourselves? What can we do to help? And I think that's a real strength. And it does come from being a relatively small island and being in close proximity to each other. I think in answer to your second question about how Russia can emulate it, I don't think it's necessarily a question of emulation, although certainly that theme of supporting each other and not necessarily feeling like you're in competition with each other. It's more about, you know, I think when it comes to the content that you're creating, there's two folds, I suppose. One is find yourself a niche. You know, Russia has stories to tell just like any nation on earth. And I think one of the most exciting things about the video games industry in 2021 is that we're starting to look at the diversity of stories that we're telling, and whether that's stories from a gender specific perspective or different cultural backgrounds, or you know, different stories that people want to give a voice to. I think that's where, you know, Russia can have a really proud and not necessarily niche either. Some of the biggest stories that come out of these sort of, you know, kind of cultural nuances are, you know, can really break out and resonate with a global audience, because a good story is a good story universally. So be proud of the heritage, be proud of the stories that you can tell. And, you know, I think, you know, I've worked probably embarrassingly on only one, or yeah, the one that springs to mind, I worked on IL-2 Sturmovik, which was built out of a development studio in Moscow. And it's one of the best games that I've ever worked on critically, and did very well commercially as well, because it was developed relatively cheaply, but went on to do, you know, 500,000 units. Which
indeed, Tim, sorry, I just paused for a second.
Yeah.
Can you say the name of the game again? Because there's some interest in the audience that you've been working on a Russian product. So
yeah, it was called IL-2 Sturmovik. It was made by a company called Gaijin, who I'm pretty sure based in Moscow. I'm fairly certain. And it was a flight simulator game. It was the latest in a long line of Sturmovik games, or IL-2 games. And it was very successful for 505 Games, who I went on to from Activision. And by successful, I mean it was 500,000 units, but that was a big deal for 505 Games at that time. It was one of our biggest sellers that we'd had. Certainly, it represented 505's introduction to a core gaming audience, and you know, proper development, proper console development that had sort of eluded us to that point. So yeah, it was a fairly pivotal moment for 505.
we're going to come on to 505. I just want to ask a question to you about the music industry. Actually, going right back to the start, there's been a question in the Q&A asking about you know, sort of your understanding of that sort of connection between music and games. Now, it might be a question you can't answer, but we're going to go for it anyway. So,
Sure.
If there's an individual out there that wants to get onto a project as a composer, how do they approach? I mean, I guess it's a question for all sort of service providers and interested people. How do you approach a games company, large or small, and get in front of them with your particular skills, whatever they are, in this case, composing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure I will have a good answer for it, because I've only actually been working in a developer for about 2.5 years. We have at Hello Games, we have an audio director, who, because we're a small team, he makes all the audio himself, and we very rarely feel the need or have the capacity to go out and hire externally, but certainly developers do all the time. And again, I would start, if I was a composer, I would probably start by just getting myself networked up, do my research, find out who composes. There's a guy called Austin Winstory, who's probably, if not the most famous games composer in the business. He's certainly one of them. You know, he's a go-to guy. He did the soundtrack for a game that I worked on that I absolutely love called Abzu. He did prior to that, he did Journey.
Do you mind saying his name again, actually, just so we can
Sure. Yeah, Austin
follow him?
Wintory.
Austin Wintory. Okay,
Yeah.
amazing. Thank you.
And yeah, so there's many guys like Austin who who are on Twitter. They have public profiles. More often than not, they're willing to give support to their ilk. I remember, actually, a quick anecdote. I was stood at the BAFTA Game Awards outside, where one of the games that 505 had published was nominated in the sound category, in the audio category. And the audio for this particular game, the game was Virginia by Variable State. Really cool little indie game, quite an unassuming title, but very sort of David Lynch-esque. But the remarkable thing about this particular award was that the soundtrack had been made by a first-time video game composer straight out of college. He'd answered an ad that Variable State had, and Variable State were like a 2 or 3 man person team at the time. He'd answered an ad that they put in whatever publication it was. I couldn't tell you. And I was stood outside the BAFTA Game Awards that year. And the BAFTA Game Awards for the Russian audience is quite a big deal in the UK games calendar. He was stood outside with me. We were waiting for the other guys to turn up, and his girlfriend went past and was like, "Oh yeah, good luck." You know, his mother and dad had been invited, so that they were sort of wishing him luck and stuff like this. And it was just really, really amazing to have that moment where he was a BAFTA nominated game composer, you know, straight out of college. And he only went and won the thing that night. And 505 gave him that moment, or, you know, Variable State really gave him that moment. But it was nice to be part of that moment, that he could be there to accept the BAFTA with his mother and father and his girlfriend in attendance. Like that's one of the most special moments I've had in games, actually, you know, when I look back on it.
Does make you wonder, doesn't it, and show how, you know, individuals' first job, first career can reach such heights.
Yeah.
You know, it's amazing how you can make your way into the industry with a bit of luck. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
You know, things had to fall into place to make that work. But amazing, absolutely amazing. I love it. Now, you mentioned 505 a second ago, so that's your next stop in your career progression. Now, not quite as well known as Activision as a business, but still a European-wide publisher, distributor. How were things different? You know, what was different about working for a company like 505, Italian-owned, I believe?
Yeah, that's right.
How is that different from working for the likes of Activision?
So I remember coming up with the phrase not long after I joined 505, leave what you don't need at the door. And what I meant by that was, I think by the time I left Activision, we had got to a point where we were really spinning our wheels on forecasting and methodologies. There was like, you know, you couldn't analyze the data enough. You know, it was go and do it again, and you were spending more time in spreadsheets than you were actually, you know, marketing the games. And when I joined 505, there was a lot of stuff that I'd learned that was really, really valuable, really crucial stuff. But the crucial the difference was, actually, you didn't have to do it ad infinitum or to the nth degree. You could do just enough forecasting, just enough to give you a sense of how successful could this be, or how should we market this particular game. You had the basics and the building blocks, but you didn't need to spend all your time, you know, as I said, spinning your wheels. And that I suppose, going back to what I was saying before, was the balance between having a discipline and a methodology, but adding or affording yourself the time to be creative, be innovative, be excited about the stuff that you're working on. And you know, we didn't have, it was semi-public, but it was basically a family company. So we were quite autonomous in what we were doing. We didn't have investors breathing down our necks every quarter saying, where's the quarter-on-quarter growth coming from? It was the mantra at 505 was more about slow, sustainable growth, which was actually really reassuring. We didn't necessarily celebrate with the really good times, but we didn't bemoan the bad times, the failures. That the path of the 10 years that I was there were some highlights that I'm sure we'll touch on, and there were some failures as well. And I think the key is not to grow too much when times are hot, when times are good, because you never really know when you're going to catch the next cold, or you'll never know when the next hit is going to come. So the owners, the two brothers at the top of the group, we would bemoan the fact that they wouldn't afford us a little bit of celebration time when we had a hit, but at the same time, if we had a massive failure and we were writing off a couple of $1 million or euros of investment because something hadn't quite hit the mark, they were like, okay, well, we'll learn from that, we won't necessarily do that again, or we'll see what we can. They took each of those failures as a learning, not necessarily as a chance to beat us over the head. So it was a very measured approach, and as I said, it was all done within the confines of the publishing organization, as opposed to some spurious investor that was looking for the next 20% growth or whatever.
So let's look at some of the extra work that landed on your desk then there.
Sure.
We're talking about strategy, we're talking about forecasting, we're talking about planning. These are the absolute fundamentals of running a games business, trying to be as accurate as possible with your plans, trying to identify market opportunities. That must have been it's a bit of a close question, so I'll follow up with an open one, but that must have been incredible to be in an environment like that, where suddenly what you say is making a difference to the company's direction to a far greater way than it would have been in a larger company.
Yeah.
How did you find that whole experience, and perhaps the pressure that came with it? How did you find that?
I didn't really feel the pressure. I was excited by the fact that we were constantly reinventing ourselves. And when I look back, you don't really feel it happening at the time, but when I look back, we probably reinvented ourselves as an organization several times over in my 10 or 11 years that I was there. We started as a bricks and mortar packaged goods business in the casual game space, with a breakout hit called Cooking Mama, which was a massive success across Europe for the Nintendo DS system. And then not long after I joined, we realized, this casual game space is only going to last for so long. The platforms that we were specializing in, the DS and the Nintendo Wii, were already on a decline. And we knew we needed to get off the iceberg, as I called it, and get ourselves onto the proper consoles and into sort of mid-core, if not proper core gaming, as soon as we possibly could. But that's quite difficult when the average development cost of a DS game, was a couple of $100,000 maybe, and the cost of a PlayStation 3/Xbox 360 game at that time was maybe a couple of million. And so that's a major leap to take, but a leap that we had to take, and we sort of found a way to do it, as I said, with things like IL-2 Sturmovik, where it was developed for, I think, a couple of million on 4 formats, and went on to do 500,000 units across the world, and was a very profitable game. And we had a couple like that where it was clever deals that were relatively inexpensive but had huge potential. And then not long after we'd managed to make that transition, we found our first million unit seller in Sniper Elite 2, which was a co-production with Rebellion, a UK developer. And that co-production deal, kind of 50% funding from each party, was quite a common thing that we did in order to get ourselves on the ladder of proper video game development in the big boys console space. And then from then on, moving to digital, and this is around the time where we found Terraria and Payday, Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons, Abzu. Those sorts of games all came, and they all did very well in that sort of kind of digital crossover. So yeah, you look back on it and you may say that you're sort of chasing the latest big thing, but I like to think that we were, we had our eye on the market, but at no point did anyone sit down and go, right, our strategy for the next 3 to 5 years has to be X, because the market moves so quickly. And yes, if you're a NASDAQ company, the investors want to know this is where we're going to be in 3 to 5 to 10 years time. But for a family company, we could be a lot more, we would call it fast followers rather than first movers, because that's the key place for us to be. Let someone else try it out first. And if there's a market there, if there's a consumer demand there, if there's a big enough amount of money to be had there, then you can move fast because you're a relatively small and nimble organization. So strategy was something that happened relatively organically, but that's not to say it happened passively. It was very much an always on active approach to where is the whole market going, leaping on opportunities as they occurred. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
It does. And the other two things that I want to talk about, I want to come back to in a second, about publishing indie games. A lot of the games you've mentioned there were made by small teams. I'll be interested to hear the sort of the strategy behind that, and let's look at that through the lens of our audience today are probably making indie games themselves. So what are the opportunities for them to sort of get in front of a publisher and make that work? But the bane of my life for many years was a game called Cooking Mama. Working for another publisher and doing product evaluation and forecasting, and 505 releasing this game that really no one thought was going to do anything in particular, and it became an enormous seller. I mean, it sold over 1 million in the UK alone, at a very decent retail price. I mean, what an amazing piece of business that was. And whenever I turned a game down for the 2 years afterwards, everyone would say to me, but you would have turned down Cooking Mama, wouldn't you? And I went, of course I would. There was no way that game. So, you did something brilliant with that. How on earth do you sign a game like that? And you couldn't have done it for Activision. It would have never worked.
Yeah.
How do you make that decision? How do you really pick those titles? And then we'll move into sort of the indie games afterwards, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure. You're absolutely right. I have to say, hand on heart, I wasn't there when Cooking Mama was signed. I arrived maybe a year after, but we were certainly in the throes of it. But I can tell you the story because it was quite apocryphal in the halls of 505. Cooking Mama was picked up on a shopping trip to Japan. The owners of 505 did a lot of work with Japan as distributors in the lead up to setting up 505. So they had quite a few contacts out there. And on one trip they went shopping quite literally in the malls of Tokyo, and picked up, I don't know, maybe 6 to 10 DS games that had already been released in Japan, and they brought them back and they played them. And one of them was Cooking Mama. And I don't think anyone really sat down, again, they may rewrite history, but I don't think anyone really sat down and thought this is going to be our future. But they picked the rights up to Cooking Mama from pretty much a glorified distribution deal, really, because the game has already been made. The development costs had already been written off, so the cost to secure the licensing for Europe distribution was relatively small. But again, I would say that was just one example of many clever deals that happened while I was there. That I mentioned the IL-2 Sturmovik thing, or the co-production deals. There are many ways that you can make commerciality work for both parties, and I think we sort of plowed a furrow there in that respect. We were the sort of original indie publisher. We almost wrote it down, but I don't think we ever did. But our sort of tenets were, we're going to be open, we're going to be honest, we're going to be transparent with our development partners. And that was a far cry from where Activision were, in the early noughties. Very much we were willing to share our P&L with the developers and sit down and put it in front of them and say, look, if we make this, you make this, and this is what everyone takes home at the end. If it, like that approach was very unique at that time. I think it's a lot more commonplace now, and for good reason. The developers, we're in a really good place in video games now, where developers have taken their rightful place as the powerhouse, the engine that drives everything. And for a long time, they were in the shadow of the publisher, or the music label, as we as we call it. And for a while there, people didn't even know that Tony Hawk's Pro Skater was made by Neversoft, or Call of Duty was made by Infinity Ward. It was an Activision game, and that was wrong. And I think the last 20 years has been a migration towards pushing the developer forward, or the developers pushing themselves forward, actually, as the main creative driver of our entire industry. So the wrongs of the past have been rewritten and righted.
So for all those developers out there, get out there, promote your game, make it work. And if you don't have to work with a publisher anymore, do you? I mean, it can be very, very useful if you want to get that exposure and the marketing push and the know-how.
Yeah,
publishers have still got an important place to play. But yes, really fascinating. Really fascinating. So saying that you're fast followers, that was definitely something you led from the front on, in terms of getting out there to reach those indie games and identifying that opportunity, which is brilliant.
Your audio's gone a little bit, Sam. I'm not sure if it's gone for everyone, but I can hear you a bit more quietly.
And
I can still hear you. It's fine, just as long as everyone else can.
Well, it's not about me, it's more about you. So that's the good news. What's the favourite game you've worked on then, Tim? You've name checked a few games here. We'll get onto Hello Games in a second. That might be your favourite game. I don't know, but
yeah.
What's your favourite game?
So I've got a couple. Abzu from Giant Squid was the intersection of one of my favorite out of work hobbies, which is diving, scuba diving, and gaming. So when that came across our green light table at 5:05, my hand shot up like anyone's business, and I think that's been certainly one that I always come back to. Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons is another one. A really sweet little game that went on to do big things, and actually was commercially successful. But more important to that, it was made by Joseph Faris was the creative director on it, who went on to found Hazelight Studios and has now done amazing things with A Way Out and It Takes Two. So it was the start of his career, just as Abzu was the start of Giant Squid's career, or studios at least. And I suppose when I look back and look at the favorite games that I have, it's when it's a new team about to start out on something new and exciting, and I tend to gravitate towards those small teams and the stories that we're about to tell together. I mentioned Virginia. I can't hand on heart say I understood Virginia as a game, and I remember when it was in development and Jonathan was delivering builds, I had to get my producer, who really admired what they were doing and got it and saw it. And they would say it's brilliant. I can't, I don't know what to tell you. It's amazing. And there were a number of people in 505 that would tell me that, and I was like, that's great, because I love these guys and I love what they're trying to do. It just doesn't necessarily connect with me. But yeah, like my favorite games are the ones that I suppose tell a bit of an underdog story, and maybe that's me in a nutshell. Moving from Activision, where initially we were the underdog chasing EA, to 505, who were still kind of clawing their way up the up the ladder and trying to, nestle into the video game world, or the publishing world at least. And then Hello Games, which is probably, I don't know, the ultimate underdog story that we might talk about in a minute. But yeah, those are the ones that sort of come to mind. Tony Hawk will always have a special place in my heart, because we worked on 7 or 8 games together during the 6.5 years I was at Activision, and that's a long old journey. So that's another one.
What about games that you wish you would have worked on? Games worked on by other people. What made you envious? What did you think? Oh, I'd love to have worked on that game.
Yeah, I've been asked this question a few times, and I always come back to Half-Life 2. And I think the reason for that is because I remember playing Half-Life 2 at Activision. We would jump on games, after work or whatever. And I just remember like the feeling of physicality in that world, and also the level design, the game design in general, and the story that it was telling. I don't think I played Half-Life 1. In fact, I've recently gone back and played Black Mesa, which is the mod of Half-Life 1, just to catch up on the story, or work out what happened before Half-Life 2. And then I went on recently to play Half-Life Alyx with VR. I actually built my own PC, which I never thought I'd hear myself saying, but during lockdown, I decided I'm going to build my own PC because I really want to play Half-Life Alyx, and I don't have anything powerful enough to run it on. I had a Quest, and I knew that I could tether it to a powerful PC. But yeah, the Half-Life 2 and Half-Life Alyx are probably games that I really wish I would have been able to play on, or work on rather.
That's amazing. What we're talking about, I have no idea you built your own PC. That's pushed you up in my estimations, and I think you're brilliant anyway. So imagine. But what, in terms of sort of inspiration, we're still talking about sort of on a personal level here. What are the maybe what inspires you as a person? But then maybe are there people within the games industry or things in the games industry that really inspire you? So the first one doesn't have to be within the games industry. So what are the things that really get you inspired and motivated?
Yeah, I think I go to people like Jacques Cousteau, David Attenborough, like people who have an ecological instinct. One of the things that I love doing, as I've said, is scuba diving, and free diving now more recently. I love the underwater world, and I see what's happening to it, and I see the likes of Jacques Cousteau and now Philippe Cousteau, his son and the rest of his family, continuing his legacy, just to try and fix it and to try and make it better. And David Attenborough, in his own inimitable style. If the Russian audience don't know who he is, he's the narrator behind all of the BBC's Blue Planet content, and many other documentaries over his, I don't know, 50-60 year career in broadcasting. And I just love to be able to sit down. Obviously Jacques Cousteau has now passed away, but I'd love to be able to sit down with those sorts of people and figure out a way, to how can we fix this? How can we, with the COP26 thing still ringing in our ears, like how can video games and the problem solvers we have, how can we get to grips with this? Because there's got to be, we solve far more complicated problems than this. And if we treated, the environment like we treat a video games challenge, we could go into pre-production on saving the world, tomorrow, and working out all the technical challenges if we got our heads together. In terms of back in the industry, I mean, it seems glib to talk about one or two people, but I would go back to that sense of underdog. I like it. I like it when there's a small team trying to do big things. And again, when we talk about my current position, that's essentially what Hello Games is, a small team doing ridiculously ambitious things. And I think, again, looking back, Activision were a a shadow of their current self, back in the early noughties. Still a relatively a bit of a cut and thrust organization, still trying to catch the big dog at the top. And 505 were the same. So instead of saying, I admire person X or person Y, I think I would just say, like, anyone who's trying to do ambitious stuff, I've got the most amount of respect for.
And there's a question from the audience, actually, which I don't know the origins of this story, but it's a question around sort of age of games designers. So the sort of the youngest and the oldest game designers that you've met who are successful. I don't think age has really got anything to do with it, has it? But I mean, just in terms of, I guess, studios you've come across, have you ever been struck by how young or how old some of the people are in the games industry? Has that not really happened yet?
No, I don't. I can't say that it has, and it's a really good question, an interesting one, and maybe, and I'm happy if this is the case. Maybe I am very sort of blind when it comes to age, gender, color, race. Like, I feel that, good game design and good game development in general, comes from diversity of input, and we happen to tell, for a long time, the video games fraternity, and I use that word quite deliberately, told stories of a specific type, and tended to gravitate towards genres of a particular ilk that resonated with them as game makers, but also teenage boys. That was back in the day, that was pretty much the domain that you catered for. But now that's entirely wrong and entirely different, and rightly so. I don't think that's necessarily because we've diversified as an industry. I think it's because we've seen that the audience has diversified, and we've sort of risen to meet that kind of creative or even commercial challenge. But I do think that the more that we can populate our developers with, older people, female people, people of ethnic minorities, the more color we can add to those stories. And whenever I'm talking about something like this, I'm always reminded of the Black Panther moment. Suddenly Hollywood realized that an ensemble piece with a cast makeup such that it has, could be successful, not just for a particular audience, but for a global audience. And I don't think we've had that moment yet, and I long for it to happen.
You don't think we've had that moment in games yet?
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Interesting. Okay. I mean, the industry is painfully slow, but finally waking up that diversity is the way forward. It's taken a long time for it to realise. But in fact, if you look at the people that work in the games industry, as things like the games industry census that Yuki does of the workers in the games industry, we've got all sorts working in that sector, and it's brilliant to see that sort of creativity coming through. But there's always more that can be done. So thanks for that question. It was interesting one. So thank you for taking it as well, Tim. Now, the final stage. It's not the final stage of your career, because that sounds like it's about to come to an end. But the story so far leads us to Hello Games, and they're a I would call them a fairly secretive, a fairly quiet indie studio.
Mm-hmm.
What's it like to work at Hello Games?
It's a bit like Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. It's no one really knows what we're working on. Every now and again, we'll throw something out the door and close the doors quickly behind it. And we talk through our patch notes We talk through the content we create for No Man's Sky. We tend to err more towards that than to any sort of, official communications or releases, or we don't do a lot of talking, but we do a lot of listening. we listen to pretty much everything that is said about certainly No Man's Sky. We don't necessarily pander to it. We hear everything that people are saying, and No Man's Sky is now such a big game. There are a million different opinions of what we should be working on next, what features we should be bringing, and I'm certainly not about to tell you anything about what we're working on at the moment, because that would burst the bubble of intrigue and curiosity that I think we've built up over years. But
is that a cultivated stance then? Is that a deliberate ploy to not be so public about what you do?
I think in a way, but that's generally how we see. People aren't necessarily that bothered about what you say. They're bothered about what you do. And Sean, our creative director and CEO, has kind of said that in public. When he does step on stage, on the rare occasions that he sort of appears in public, like I think he got this advice from Valve, like just after the No Man's Sky launch. It's like, people aren't bothered about what you say. You can talk about the game and the launch, whatever, as long as you like. But what they really care about is, are you working on it? Are you going to fix it? Are you going to, what are you doing to make the game better? And that's really the mantra we live by, day in, day out. But what has happened, because of that sort of closed door, sort of, fortress mentality, we've created a really strong bond in the studio across a relatively small team. The team on No Man's Sky is still to this day like 20-25 people for a game that is an infinite universe, which is ridiculous, really. And it's largely down to the technology that we've created, that we're able to do things like that. But it has galvanized us, and everyone in the studio kind of accepts that that's the culture. I mean, it does mean that we're a little invisible at times, but that's fine. Like, we don't really crave the limelight, and we sort of relish the anonymity, really.
So if we can't ask you questions, I can't ask you questions, and neither can the audience, about what you're working on. Let's talk about that sort of creative process, because you've described a team that's listening all the time and taking all those ideas on board, not necessarily responding to them all, which is fair enough. Otherwise, you wouldn't have a game, of course, because you'd be doing a million different things.
Yeah.
But how does that creative process work then in a studio? I mean, how many people are working there now?
So we've got about 30 dev across 3 different projects. The No Man's Sky team is about 20, something like that. It's difficult. They move around a little bit. But in terms of the creative process, what struck me when I joined was that it was very bottom up. People work on what they want to work on, which I think is reflected in the game itself. People, like, maybe in contrast, or certainly in comparison to publishing, it's a very flat structure. Somewhere like, that you would consider, like Valve kind of famously work, people work on things that they conceive of and build up from. Like, your average No Man's Sky update, is the idea of, a couple of people, and normally it's kind of brought to life by those, 2 or 3 people. So it's not like there's someone at the helm, Sean or anyone else, saying this is what we should be working on next. It very much bubbles up from the programmers, the artists, the designers, and I think that makes for a really kind of happy environment, and it seems to be working. It seems to be reflected in the enthusiasm that No Man's Sky continues to have, and the passion that people continue to have for it, which is great. It's 5 years anniversary this year, and doesn't seem to be slowing down, which is great.
Yeah, it's incredible. And then it does lead to, I guess, you think about the companies that you've worked for and the size they've got to. There could be a temptation to really upsize this business, get new products out, build on what you've learned while still maintaining that existing team. That is such an enormous decision for a small studio to take. Do you ever think Hello Games are going to make such a big decision, or is that too difficult to look in the future and know?
I think the only way I can really answer that is that the story that I keep coming back to, that Sean tells reasonably frequently, is like, when you set out to create an infinite universe, the last question you ask is, how many people do I need? It's a bit of a nonsense question. I'm sure when you're Ubisoft and you're setting out to create Assassin's Creed, yes, you need to build a world that is X square kilometers, in area, and therefore I'm going to need an army of artists and an army of programmers to build that world. No Man's Sky is different in that it's procedurally generated, and therefore the first question you ask is, what technology do I need to create a universe that is almost infinite? And then the second question you ask is, given that technology, how few people can I get away with? Which is a totally different way of looking at it. But it does mean that we can fulfill our mantra of doing, big things with really small teams. So the answer, I suppose, is, we wouldn't be averse to growing, maybe a little bit, but we relish the size of the team and the size of the impact we can have with that small team.
Well, based on what you've just said, I'm going to cross out what's next for Hello Games, so we won't do that question. But we have been looking back, actually, throughout the whole interview, particularly looking back at sort of your career and your progression. Let's pivot it and have a quick look forward, shall we? Where do you think the games industry, and I'd be interested because you're the chairman of chair of the organisation that I work for, Yuki. So
Yeah.
What you say now might direct what I'm doing in the next few years. But let's say, where do you think the games industry is going to be going in the next 3 to 5 years? Get your crystal ball out, if there is such a thing. Where are we heading?
Well, I think the good news is that there will be continued growth. I don't think there's probably many people that would argue with that. We've been on an amazing growth trajectory since the dawn of video games, but we now seem to have supercharged that. Certainly the last couple of years, as people have really taken another look at games and the value that we bring culturally, economically, psychologically. It's a real powerhouse that has suddenly got the attention of the wider world. For a long time, we've, us within the industry, we've always known that it's an amazing place to work. It's an amazing creative endeavor, and it's an amazing place to forge a career. I think now I'm starting to feel that we're growing up. We've got we're maturing. We've got a lot of responsibility in that maturing process. We're always sort of pushing the boundaries of business models and consumer behaviors, and you name it. There's always something that we're sort of poking at as we try and grow, as we try and innovate, and we have to be responsible in that regard. But I think we've proven that we can be responsible in the 20-30 years that we've been going. And I think the other thing that I would say is that we're never that far away from the next distraction. I don't mean distraction in a dismissive way, but there's always a new shiny thing that we can play around with. And it used to be free to play, it used to be mobile, it used to be digital, it used to be, you name it. You can go back through the mists of time, and certainly I've seen a fair few of them in my 20 years. And now there's blockchain, and now there's NFTs, and how much of that is going to kind of bed in and have a real impact. And it seems to be that a number of larger companies have come out and said, yep, this is the future. And whether that's true or not, or whether it's just something that we say to the investors that helps our share price, that's for the future to decide. But I think the one thing is that there will always be distractions and things are circling around our industry. But the one thing that has been constant since the beginning has been storytelling, and the quality of the entertainment that we're creating. So even when free to play got very mercenary and everyone was complaining that you're just playing a spreadsheet and you're just playing the metrics, and it's just trying to eke out another day for your retention or another dollar for your lifetime value. That quickly went away when people realized that actually the game still needs to be fun, and it still needs to be playable, and it still needs to deliver, value to the player. So I think I would say that, that element of the one thing that won't change in the next 3 to 5 years, or indeed the next 10 years, is going to be, we need to focus on creating really good content that entertains, that inspires, that moves people, and I think those are going to be constant no matter what era you enter the industry, or no matter where you are in your career.
And talking about your career, what does that look like? I know you said earlier you're not really a planner in terms of your career. You're what was the phrase used about falling up the ladder?
Falling up the ladder, yeah.
I mean,
yeah, there's still a couple of rungs.
I was about to say, what are the next rungs?
Me.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, I don't know. You get to the if I wasn't ambitious when I started my career, I'm even less ambitious now. You get to a point, I'm a late 40s guy now, and I'm really, what I really crave now is just working with people that I like, and doing good work, and work that kind of means something. And for young aspiring developers, or people looking to get into the games industry, that might seem incredibly old man speak, but certainly, like, there's good to be made. Like, games, yes, they are great entertainment, and they can provide hours and hours of distraction, but they can be so much more than that. So anyone coming into the industry now, that it doesn't need to be an old man saying, I want to give something back. There is plenty that games can do in the here and now to tell good stories, to move people to ecological motivation or whatever. So I think that's probably why I would say, I'm really happy just to keep falling up.
And just as I was going to bring this to the end, there's been a plethora of questions coming in, which is just typical. So I thought we'd ended on a nice high then, but I'm gonna come back with some other questions.
Another climax.
I know, another ladder rung there, waiting to be strode up. Really, a question that's come through about what's the most important thing about a game? Is it the story or the gameplay? And it's interesting, you've talked about storytelling and what have you. Mm-hmm. Is that the essence of every game, the sort of the story behind it, or is the gameplay, the way you play it, the experience, which is more important for you?
That's a really good question, whoever asked that. And you're right, I have talked.
I'll say it's Tim. I'm prepared to say it's Tim. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, well done, Tim. I think I tend to gravitate towards storytelling and games that have a story to tell. I play every game on easy because I don't have time, and I'm not ashamed to say so, because I want to hear where the story goes, and I want to get to the end of it, and I don't have time to get stuck on a boss battle that I just can't get past. But I know that there are one of the best things about games is that there are so many different games for so many different types of gamer, and different people get their kicks out of so many different things. The people who play real-time strategy games are of a particular ilk. People who play third-person shooters versus first-person shooters have a slightly different kind of wiring in their brain. They first-person shooters want to feel completely immersed, whereas third-person shooters maybe a particular affinity with a particular type of character. RPGs, the list of genres really reflects the list of types of player types that we have in our not just in our business but in the world. We're now starting to see what mobile gamers, certainly what they like at the moment, but mobile gaming will in 3 to 5 years time will take on a completely different hue, as it gets more and more complex, and as those devices get more and more powerful. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question. I can't quite remember what it was, but it was a really good one.
No, that was an excellent way to finish. So thank you very much Tim, for joining us today and for not telling us too much about what Hello Games are up to, but that's fine. I understand the need for that. But it was lovely to sort of escort you through your career, and I hope that brought back some nice memories for you as you were talking about some of that content. Really appreciate it. I know our audience does as well. And talking of our audience, thank you very much for joining us here today. The recording will be made available afterwards, and also will be available on the YouTube channel of the British Council, as will previous talks. So next week's talk will be brought through to that imminently. And next week, we continue with our third speaker, a gentleman by the name of Ian Livingston.
Who?
Yeah, exactly, Tim. Who is he? I mean, I think in his own description, his biography, he's one of the fathers of the industry. What an amazing background. And he's an excellent talker as well. So I think I'll probably just prepare 3 questions for him, Tim, and then just ask those, and that should do the job.
I'm so happy to be the meat in the sandwich of Peter Molyneux and Ian Livingston. That's great.
Really appreciate your time once again, Tim, and thank you again, audience, for joining us today, and hope to see you at the same time next week. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sam.